Senhoras e senhores, sejam muito bem-vindos ao seminário 200 anos da imigração alemã no Brasil, o direito brasileiro em transformação, uma realização da Escola Nacional de Formação e Aperfeiçoamento de Magistrados, Enfam, e da Associação Luso-Alemã de Juristas, com o apoio do Programa de Apoio a Eventos no País, da CAPES, do Centro de Estudos Alemães e Europeus, do Instituto Brasiliense de Direito Público e do Centro de Direito Comparado. Compõem o dispositivo de honra desta solenidade Suas Excelências, o senhor Ministro do Superior Tribunal de Justiça e Diretor-Geral da Enfam, Benedito Gonçalves, o senhor Presidente da Associação Luso-Alemã de Juristas, professor doutor Stefan Grudman, a senhora Secretária-Geral da Associação Luso-Alemã de Juristas, professora doutora Carina Nunes Fritz. Para a saudação de abertura deste seminário e condução dos trabalhos, com a palavra, o ministro Benedito Gonçalves.
Boa noite a todas e a todos. É com grande satisfação que a Escola Nacional dos Magistrados recebe esse evento para comemorar os 200 anos da imigração alemã no Brasil. E o tema muito importante, que é o direito brasileiro em transformação. Saúdo essa seleta mesa, começando aqui pela professora Carina, que foi a grande mentora deste evento, tanto batalhou, idealizou e está acontecendo, secretária-geral da Associação Luso-Alemã de Juristas. Cumprimentando também o professor Stefan, que é o presidente, além de universitário, professor universitário, presidente da associação também Luso-Alemã de Juristas. Cumprimento a nossa Enfam pela toda a sua equipe de trabalho que sempre tem nos ajudado a cumprir a nossa missão constitucional. A missão da Enfam na Constituição é regular a formação, os cursos de ingresso e aperfeiçoamento dos magistrados no Brasil, da Justiça Federal e da Justiça Estadual. E na Constituição está lá, dentre outras funções, e aqui está uma das outras funções. Cumprimento a todos na pessoa do secretário-geral da Enfam, juiz Ilan, o secretário executivo da Enfam, Dr. Leonardo Peter. Fica aqui sempre os nossos agradecimentos. Eu, na qualidade de diretor-geral, nunca posso deixar de reconhecer a dedicação deles e de todos aqueles que integram a Enfam. Uma síntese da nossa imigração alemã no Brasil teve início em 1824, quando os primeiros colonos chegaram ao sul do país, estabelecendo comunidades que rapidamente se tornaram referências em desenvolvimento econômico, educação e inovação. Como bem documenta Luiz Werner em sua obra, aspas, a imigração alemã no Brasil, fecha aspas, os imigrantes trouxeram consigo não apenas suas tradições culturais e agrícolas, mas também um modelo organizacional que influenciou fortemente a economia e a nossa estrutura social. A historiadora Fanny Kaufmann, em sua obra, aspas, Imigração Alemã no Brasil e outros ensaios, fecha aspas, destaca que esse movimento migratório não apenas contribuiu para a expansão econômica da região sul e sudeste, mas também teve impacto significativo na estruturação de diversos setores da sociedade, incluindo a educação e o direito. No campo jurídico, a tradição alemã se fez presente desde os tempos do Império, O Código Comercial de 1850, por exemplo, adotou elementos inspirados no modelo germânico da época. Mais tarde, o Código Civil de 1916, que veio substituir as ordenações filipinas, concebido sob a forte influência do Código Civil alemão de 1900, trouxe princípios e sistematizações que marcaram a evolução do direito privado no Brasil. Como aponta João Batista de Almeida em sua obra, aspas, a influência do direito alemão no Código Civil Brasileiro de 1916, fecho aspas. A estrutura desse código foi amplamente baseada na doutrina alemã, principalmente no que se refere à teoria dos contratos e no conceito de propriedade. A nossa Carta da República de 1988, por sua vez, incorporou diversas influências do direito constitucional alemão, especialmente no campo dos direitos fundamentais e do controle de constitucionalidade, temas que sempre estiveram no centro das discussões acadêmicas entre os dois países. Nádia de Araújo, em sua obra, aspas, Direito Comparado, fecho aspas, a influência do direito alemão e francês no Brasil, muito bem observa que a jurisprudência da nossa Corte Suprema frequentemente dialoga com o Tribunal Constitucional alemão, especialmente em temas como dignidade da pessoa humana e proteção dos direitos fundamentais. A Escola Nacional de Magistrado Enfam, que tenho a honra de dirigir, tem como missão preparar os magistrados para um judiciário cada vez mais eficiente e alinhado com os desafios da sociedade contemporânea. Nesse sentido, reconhecemos a importância do direito comparado como ferramenta essencial para aprimorar o trabalho de nossos magistrados. O intercâmbio acadêmico e jurídico com instituições como a Associação Luso-Alemã de Juristas fortalece nossa capacidade de enfrentar as complexidades do mundo jurídico atual. Vivemos uma era de transformações intensas, impulsionadas pela tecnologia, pela globalização e pelos desafios crescentes no Estado de Direito. Como bem destaca Luiz Otávio Sequeira de Lacerda, em seu Sistema Jurídico Brasileiro e sua relação com a tradição jurídica alemã, o Brasil e a Alemanha, fala ele, compartilham valores fundamentais como segurança jurídica, previsibilidade e justiça social. O fortalecimento desse intercâmbio jurídico pode ser um dos caminhos para garantir uma justiça mais moderna e eficiente. Permita-me citar grande jurista alemão, Rudolf Wandel, um dos grandes juristas alemães do século XIX. Seu trabalho enfatizava a função social do direito e sua relação com a realização da justiça. Essa ideia pode ser encontrada em sua memorável conferência, posteriormente publicada com o título de aspas, A Luta pelo Direito, fecho aspas, no ano de 1889, que foi reeditada 12 vezes em 2 anos e foi traduzida em 26 línguas, incluindo o português. Essa obra argumenta o autor que o direito não é um sistema abstrato, mas sim um instrumento voltado para alcançar objetivos sociais, a paz e a ordem na sociedade. A frase de abertura da conferência, publicada em livro, é emblemática nessa caracterização. Aspas, a paz é o fim que o direito tem em vista. A luta é o meio de que se serve para conseguir. Fecho aspas. Isto é, o direito busca a paz, fazendo-o por intermédio da luta. A premissa é válida para o indivíduo, sua classe e para o próprio Estado. Aspas, a vida do direito é uma luta, a luta dos povos, do Estado, das classes e dos indivíduos. Fecho aspas. Luta e firmeza são pré-requisitos para a construção e a manutenção de direitos, que não são dados espontaneamente pela natureza. Direitos são arduamente conquistados e, mais ainda, arduamente mantidos. Para Ehring, o direito não se interioriza, se vive, é alcançado mediante a força e a luta. Aspas. O direito não é uma pura teoria, mas uma força viva. Fecho aspas. E também de Ehring mais uma referência à conhecida metáfora da balança da justiça, no sentido de que, aspas, a justiça sustenta numa das mãos a balança, que pesa o direito, e na outra a espada, que se serve para a defender. A espada sem a balança é a força brutal. A balança sem a espada é a impotência do direito. Fecho aspas. Que possamos, inspirados por essa visão, estreitar os laços entre Brasil e Alemanha e seguir firmes na construção de um direito cada vez mais sólido, humano e democrático. Muito obrigado e a todos teremos, tenho a certeza, um excelente evento no dia de hoje na abertura e amanhã uma série de reflexões muito importantes para os operadores do direito. Muito obrigado. Passo a palavra agora à doutora Karina Nunes.
Boa noite a todos. Eu gostaria inicialmente de agradecer e cumprimentar o senhor ministro Benedito Gonçalves, diretor da Escola Nacional de Formação e Aperfeiçoamento da Magistratura, por nos receber a Associação Luso-Alemã de Juristas nesses dias, hoje e amanhã. Gostaria de cumprimentar o presidente da nossa associação, professor Stefan Grundmann, professor titular da Universidade Humboldt de Berlim. Cumprimentar a todos aqui presentes e os que nos acompanham pela internet, pelo YouTube. É com grande alegria que a Associação Luso-Alemã de Juristas realiza esse evento em parceria com a Enfam, que tem como objetivo debater, hoje e amanhã, temas atuais do direito, né? Como, por exemplo, algumas questões sobre a reforma do nosso Código Civil, questões de direito digital, principalmente o uso de inteligência artificial no judiciário, métodos alternativos de solução de conflitos e o problema urgente da regulação das plataformas e a defesa da nossa democracia. Hoje nós teremos a fala inaugural do professor Stefan Grundmann sobre empresa e sustentabilidade, um tema que é relevantíssimo não só para o direito societário, mas para a sociedade de um modo geral e para as futuras gerações. Antes de fazer a apresentação do nosso convidado, eu gostaria de pedir vênia a vocês para apresentar a nossa associação. A Associação Luso-Alemã de Juristas, que é, na verdade, a tradução do nome em alemão, que é a Deutsche Lusitanische Juristenvereinigung, ela é a mais antiga associação destinada a fomentar o diálogo comparado entre os ordenamentos jurídicos de língua portuguesa e germânica. Ela foi fundada na década de 90 pelo saudoso professor Eric Jaime, que foi professor titular na Universidade de Heidelberg. E hoje essa associação congrega juristas da Alemanha, do Brasil, de Portugal, mas também de países africanos de língua portuguesa, como Cabo Verde, Moçambique, Angola, Goa, na Índia, Timor-Leste e Macau. Então, dessa forma, a associação ela é uma das poucas associações de juristas do mundo que tem presença em praticamente todos os continentes, quase todos, Europa, América Latina, África e Ásia. E o nosso objetivo é intensificar o intercâmbio jurídico entre esses países. E é por isso que nós estamos aqui hoje. Nesse mundo globalizado em que nós vivemos, nós não podemos ficar encastelados e fechados dentro da nossa própria ordem jurídica. É necessário, sem dúvida, e todos sabem, o diálogo, porque a ciência do direito não avança sem o estudo do direito comparado. Seja com a Alemanha, seja com a França, Portugal, Itália, Estados Unidos e, por que não, com a China. E é muito importante esse diálogo do judiciário, entre o judiciário, a prática e a academia. Afinal de contas, são os juízes que aplicam as teorias e que contribuem para aperfeiçoar o direito. Na Alemanha, ministro Benedito Gonçalves, desde a entrada do Código Civil Alemão, o BGB, em 1900, o judiciário alemão teve um papel importantíssimo no desenvolvimento do direito. E muitos institutos que foram criados jurisprudencialmente, através de um trabalho conjunto entre prática e teoria, entre judiciário e academia, eles foram consagrados e inseridos no Código Civil Alemão durante a reforma de 2002. E o STJ ele também vem realizando esse papel e é importante que continue a fazê-lo, sempre num diálogo permanente com a doutrina. E eu queria dizer, ministro Benedito Gonçalves, que a Associação Luso-Alemã de Juristas ela está à disposição da Enfam para dialogar, para que nós possamos realizar outros eventos como esse. E, por isso, também nós decidimos lançar aqui na Enfam essa obra coletiva em homenagem ao Canaris, que foi, sem dúvida, um dos maiores nomes do direito privado no século XXI, quer dizer, no século XX, perdão. E, para finalizar, eu gostaria de fazer uma rápida apresentação do nosso palestrante. O professor Stefan Grundmann, ele é professor titular de Direito Privado e Empresarial, Direito Europeu e Teoria Jurídica na Humboldt Universidade, ocupando uma cátedra que, no passado, pertenceu a ninguém mais, ninguém menos do que a Savigny. E, antes de assumir a cadeira de Savigny, em 2004, Stefan Grundmann passou pelas universidades de Frankfurt an der Oder, Regensburg, Halle e Erlangen-Nuremberg. Ele foi diretor da Faculdade de Direito da Humboldt no período de 2020 a 2022 e, desde 2013, ele leciona também no Instituto Europeu de Florença, na Itália. É professor convidado de renomadas universidades como o King's College, em Londres, Roma, La Sapienza, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard e outras mais. Grundmann é um jurista completo. Ele estudou direito, filosofia e arte, sempre com a alma e os olhos voltados para o direito comparado e para o internacional, bem como para disciplinas vizinhas, como sociologia e a economia, que ele tanto adora, e não é à toa que ele é um dos especialistas na análise econômica do direito lá na Alemanha. Foi aluno do Canaris na graduação, embora ele diga que o Canaris não era o melhor dos professores, né? Ele preferiu o Klaus Roxin, o que eu acho um absurdo, mas a gente que é discípulo tem que concordar com o mestre, com ressalvas. Mas o fato é que Canaris o escolheu para substituí-lo na redação de um dos mais famosos comentários ao Código Comercial alemão, professor Marlon, o Staub HGB, que foi criado por Hermann Staub, que é muito conhecido aqui no Brasil como o pai da teoria da violação positiva do contrato. E esse espírito internacionalista e interdisciplinar de Stefan Grundmann se revela desde a sua formação, perpassa a sua vasta e riquíssima produção acadêmica e se manifesta na sua atuação profissional. Eu não vou falar sobre as obras do professor Grundmann para não cansá-los, mas eu publiquei hoje uma entrevista no Migalhas, na minha coluna German Report, e lá vocês vão poder ler e conhecer um pouco mais da vida e da obra desse grande jurista, que eu tive a honra de ser meu orientador no doutorado, e que ele é, acima de tudo, um cosmopolita e um amigo do direito brasileiro. Então, eu gostaria de agradecer ao ministro Benedito Gonçalves por essa recepção tão carinhosa aqui na Enfam e fazer um agradecimento especial ao secretário-geral da escola, o Dr. Jan Presser, e ao secretário executivo, Leonardo Peter, que não mediram esforços para que esse evento se tornasse realidade. Professor Grundmann, seja muito bem-vindo ao Brasil e obrigada a todos. Muito obrigada. Boa noite. Lhe passo a palavra.
Ministro Gonçalves, querida Karina, teria gostado de fazer esta palestra em português. A Karina disse, mas será mais preciso na língua que fala todos os dias. O que não é o alemão, mas o inglês, a língua franca, dizer assim. Amanhã, talvez, vou falar um pouco em português também, que amo tanto, mas quando a Karina disse isso, talvez o português é a língua do coração o do domingo, e hoje somos segunda-feira, então trocamos a língua de todos os dias, aquela cotidiana. I switched to English. I'm grateful to be to Brasilia again. I was here several times already, and I studied in Lisbon when I started to love that Lusophone world, really. Now, my topic for today is, of course, too big, but if you say transformation, law transforms thinking, you would think that today there is either digitalization or sustainability. Those are the mega themes of our times. I chose, because I work much more there, sustainability, and I chose the EU regime not because I want to teach you a lot about European law, but because the instruments are really universal. Still, they are applied in Europe differently. Basically, I'm speaking about information rules. Now, I speak about what I call the EU sustainable enterprise. The EU Sustainable Enterprise, but as you see, I will speak mainly about the underpinning theory. What do we think somehow? What is the background to those rules I'm speaking about? So basically what I want to do with you, I hope it continues. Where can I push here? Yeah. No? Okay. Can you perhaps? Vamos ver. Okay, so I said what I want to speak about mainly is the theory and the novelty of the theory, but of course of a certain regime, and that implies that I have to explain shortly the regime as such, which I will speak about. And then at the end, I will give you an example. That was too quick. Anyhow, I will give you an example at the end. I introduce by a little bit of history and basically a survey. A little bit of history is basically that we are speaking about that theme for 50 years now. It started really to become law with what is called the Brundtland Report of '87, and then later on, some 15 years later on, 25 years later on, the Ruggie Report of 2008. What did they basically invent as an idea? They said ecology cannot be a way we pursue without economy. And they said, and actually ecology is one of the big values for humanity, but human rights is the other big value. So basically what they pronounced at that time was that there is a triangle to follow between ecology, economy, and social sustainability. There are a few modulations which basically say, but ecology is more important and there are absolute limits or so, but I don't want to bother you with that. Now, if we look at what I'm speaking about, that is company law, and I have to explain first why company law. You could say environmental law, very easy. You stop the emissions, you put a cap to emissions, or you tax emissions. That would be the much more direct way. I am speaking about a somehow indirect way, not completely indirect, there are duties, but basically incentivization and steering of companies. Why that? Because it is not states, but companies which are the main players, the main originators of emissions, of climate change. We all are, but companies are very important, are in our mind as well. Now, the EU regime, different from other regimes, puts, of course, emphasis as well on taxing, on environmental law, but in addition has that branch to address companies. It all started basically with asking companies just to report, just to give information. What do you do about human rights and about environmental issues and climate influence? That started, as you see, in 2014. It's the last decade I'm speaking about. But you see, there is already a reform after 8 years in 2022. There are other duties introduced just now in 24, which is basically what I would call not just report, but care as well. Do something, minimize all those effects. I will not take that as examples for reasons of time, basically, but I could, of course, as well take those. And there is a third thing, which is much more addressed to the shares and to the investment into those companies, and that is if you signal that you do more than the average, then you have better chances to attract capital. This signaling philosophy is basically in the so-called taxonomy regulation, which is a regulation which now tries to define, but what is green really? Is, for instance, nuclear energy, is it green or is it not? It doesn't cause emissions. At the same time, it causes other dangers. What kinds of doing are really clear to try to dress basically a code or a system of assessing what is green really. And there are, of course, a few prohibitions with respect to Brazil. That is mainly deforestation, that you say certain things are just, European companies should not do that or invest into that. Now, with that in mind, I introduce my methodological approach. Basically, and you see I wrote a book about that, which I called a New Private Law Theory, and basically I said, not only for this topic, but for any topic, it would be more appropriate for law to say, I do not get only influence from one other disciplines like law and economics, but to see basically what the other disciplines tell us about legal problems. Sociology, philosophy, behavioral sciences, all tell us a lot about that. And the main reason is why I say we as a community of lawyers should bring in all those disciplines is that basically around 1900, law, which was the social science, got separated from little other disciplines that then became more and more important, like economics, like sociology, like behavioral sciences, etc., etc. And for that reason, I think for being really informed, you have to take the knowledge of those sciences in, but on an on a basis of equilibrium, basically saying each of those disciplines tells us about one interest or another interest in society. One more about efficiency, the other one more about cohesion, the other one more about fairness and justice. And if we have the balance about which Ministro Gonçalves spoke, that balance, if we are devoted to that, we have to take them in to some extent. I see as well that in all our constitutions, and certainly in the European Constitution, pluralism is a value. That is a pluralism of approaches. You want to bring them in all. It's written into the constitutions, into the fundamental rights chapters as well, or in the principles. And for that reason, I think even the constitutions ask us to have pluralist approaches to society. Now, with that in mind, I would say I go on, if I can go on with, perhaps I speak too much about the slides. No. Next slide. Slide. Okay. No. Okay. Now, the European regime is, of course, to be seen against the background that the European Union becomes more and more a political union as well. Now, the directive came much later because the political union started around 2000, 2007. That directive is the directive of corporate social responsibility that is on the reporting. It was called first non-financial reporting directive. Non-financial means normally companies report about their financial status. That is important for creditors, that is important for shareholders, because it decides on the returns from that company. And it is a big shift in ideas that you say, well, companies should report as well on what does not have an impact on their finance. but rather because they have a social responsibility, what they produce as problems, so to speak. So the non-financial reporting sounds very technical, but it indicates a big shift in paradigm already. You even report on your impact you have in the world, even without that being important for your own financial status. The content was, there are only two things which are so important that one imposes on companies that should create returns, of course, normally, as well to report on those non-financial items. And that is human rights and influence on the environment, namely emissions, mainly a climate change-related impact. Why that? Because they are so important. And what was the shift? The reporting is on the company as such, but a company normally outsources many, many things. It has a production chain, it has a distribution chain. So the idea was a company in Europe should be responsible for the chains it has and which it steers to some extent. So a responsibility doesn't stop at the border of the company, but where the influence stops. Now, that means reporting on the value chains as well, not only on the company, but on the value chains the company steers. Now, as I said, this directive is already amended 8 years later, and that indicates, of course, it was not ideal in the beginning, and we will speak about that in our one example. The problem, the main problem we will speak about is this reporting under the rules of European law goes, because it's all digitalized and you can read, everybody can read it. It doesn't go to shareholders only, it goes to the public, it goes to the NGOs, it goes to the government, it goes to the public opinion. So who is the addressee of that reporting is our main question. With that in mind, I think I skip, the computer did it already, skip basically the other measures. As I said, there are other measures. There is one now, 24, where one says reporting is perhaps not enough. Try to minimize those impacts. The burning of a factory in India, or emissions in Brazil or something. Try to minimize at least. Not completely abolish, but minimize at least. And the other things. But as we want to see the theory behind as well, as I said, I skipped those other measures and go now into the theory. All those rules, and mainly, and somehow the reporting rule as well, is to be seen on recommendations which are global. And they are normally, it's written, each region, each state has to find a smart mix of measures. A smart mix of measures. Now, why did Europe find this mix of measures is smart? The first big thing is that Europe, with this reporting directive, but of course as well with the due diligence directive, introduces now not a soft recommendation, but a hard law recommendation. And of course, once reporting, of course, creates reliability, if you don't say the truth, so to speak, then it's a pretty hard rule already. So that is the one big step to add, so to speak, the sword. You cut as well to some extent because it's seen as being so important. The second thing, and here is the smart mix, it is basically an addition to emission rights trading, taxes, caps to emissions, and all that. That is there as well. So it is basically something in addition, and why do you think that you should have that in addition? That is my real question. Now comes the reach of those duties. What Europe does is somehow it says it is a European regulation, but with global reach. And that is a very new step to some extent as well, because it says European companies have a responsibility outgoing for all their value chains. But in the 2022 update, there was a new layer added as well, and that was incoming. Because with respect to taxes, for instance, or with respect to emission rights trading, you cannot impose that on other companies in the world. That is impossible. You cannot tax a US, American, or a Chinese company. But what you can do is to say, when you have a certain market share in Europe, you want the European consumers. We think you should tell us, well, what is your climate change impact, human rights impact. So you have a global reach as well incoming, that you say, you want to be in Europe, and all big companies, global companies want to be, then report on what you are doing. The next change is that definition. Of course, that will be reformed still a few times, but somehow to have a set of reference, what is green, is helpful, of course, especially for those signaling things that you say, I want to sell my capital better than others because I'm greener. I will not speak about that, and I will skip the digital arena as well. That, as a regulation, is already pretty new, and now there is the criticism. But doesn't that overburden all our companies, the European companies? Of course, there you have to say what I said at the end. You don't overburden only the European companies. You impose that pretty much also to other companies having a share or an impact in the European market. So, but do you not overburden companies, so to speak? And I think in theory you have to say this. Basically, I think that there is a change in theoretical stance with respect to economy in this area and perhaps more generally. We had it with the global financial crisis a little bit already, stability as a public value, but now the public values become in much more clearly, and therefore you would say it's a green development, so to speak. And the main thing, the main idea has been described by Habermas, basically in his Facticity and Norms, a book of the end of the 1990s, where he says, if we look at Western societies under the rule of law, democratic societies, actually it is neither true that only the private autonomy primes, nor is it true that only the public autonomy dominates. The two dominate to some, or they are in an equilibrium. We have those fundamental rights, and the individual is very, very important since the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment. But at the same time, we have that idea that the public good is something important, and democracy is something important, and there has to be the public will as well. And therefore, he says, private autonomy and public autonomy are always to be brought into equilibrium. And one important thing already is basically that you say individualism doesn't have the complete primacy. It is important, but it cannot prime always. And that often in company law is said, yes, the companies have to decide, have to have their returns, and you have to prove that there is a good public good that you can restrain us. While Habermas would say, well, the two are to be brought into equilibrium. Now, what does that mean for our area? I would say you can understand what is developed in those rules only if you say, I have a pluralist approach to theory. You have to start, and all scholarship and sciences are not monolithic, not all have the same idea, but there is a lot of dispute in climate research. In legal research, we are never of the same opinion. We quarrel about that. In economics, they are of course not of the same opinion. In sociology, there are always many opinions, and good opinions. And for instance, if you start with climate change and climate research, there are those that say basically the world will not be livable in 50 years. There are those who say if we do not change, there will be a lot of migration and a lot of chaos on the world, but still livable. And others that even say we cannot influence the climate. The climate is much too strong. It cannot be man-made. Of course, we can cause some trouble, but the climate change, we couldn't stop it really. Now, if that is the case, if climate research basically goes from different extremes, so to speak, we cannot say it is certainly like this or like this, like that. But what we can say, and now we come to somehow sociology and philosophy, what we can say is that in Europe about 30% of the people say the next generation will not exist any longer. And that is a fear which is really existential. It's not just a little bit more of money or so, it is really existential. And if you have now those 30% as a rule setter, you have to say, I want to create a society and an order of society where those 30% are taken into account as well. Of course, those that want to have more return should be taken into account as well. Now comes in political philosophy. One of the most famous images of the political philosophy of the 20th century, John Rawls, with his theory of justice, is that idea that we should decide behind the so-called veil of ignorance. What is that? John Rawls said, if we as rational people knew the society, we know the society, but we do not know who we will be in the society. Will I be the CEO or will I be the climate activist? If we did not know that, what would that mean for that situation? And I'm certain that one would say, okay, a bit less of return, even if it overburdens what I said now, somehow the company, a little bit it overburdens. We will have perhaps less income. And having that existential fear that already my children will not live any longer. Probably we would say we have to do a bit more. We have to do something at least. We have, for instance, to say, well, those that cause climate change most, if that is true, that we can influence climate change, that those, and that is the companies, think of what they are doing. We want to make them aware and accountable for what they do in order to safeguard those 30% that have existential fear, even if it reduces a bit the returns, at least in short run, perhaps not even in long run. And now we come to sociology in red. The big idea of sociology about how norms act is if you believe in a certain value and you have acted along the lines of these values, and even only if you have thought about that value carefully enough, you will more easily internalize that value. See it as your own value, so to speak. And what do the norms about reporting do? Basically, they say the board has to think about what its impact is in Brazil, in India, etc., etc. Write a report. Perhaps have liability afterwards, but already writing a report is somehow, oh, that is important, that is a value. Perhaps next time in a decision, I take it into account. That idea of internalization, I think, is important with those rather soft rules we have with reporting. And then, of course, the economists, they say, and that is the Brundtland report was that as well, well, we do it because we will have returns with that. If we create other energies, of course, we can sell those goods afterwards, and that will create return. But the real clash is, it may be that return and green is not the same thing. Often it will be the same thing, but what is the clash? And then we need those other disciplines to say, if we want to have a good equilibrium somehow of the interests, yes, reporting rules, even if they overburden to some extent, perhaps they are acceptable to some extent. From the societal level to the individual level, I take myself. If I invest, I have 2 daughters, very green. Papa, you are of the wrong generation. I'm decently rich, not very rich. I invest a little bit. In that situation of investment, I'm neither only return-oriented, nor only altruistic. Normally, the disciplines describe it always, you have homo economicus, only return-oriented, and you have those idealists, only altruistic. I think the mixture is the real thing, and that is difficult for a forecast of my behavior, of course, for behavioral sciences. I will say a bit less of return, and my daughters are happy. Of course, I'll do that, and I show them what nice investment I have done. That is a completely, theoretically, a completely new behavioral sciences question you have there. And I would say you have a totally new set of addressees, and that is my example. And you have now something I always thought that was very important theoretically, that is bringing contract law and company law together. Typically, it's 2 areas. But here, as the value chains are steered by a company, you cannot sever the link between the 2. You have to see contract law and company together. And why do I say they belong to each other? Because those are the 2 areas where private autonomy is largest. It's somehow the center of private law where you can decide really and shape your life via either a firm or a market. And in this respect, you should think them in parallel. Now I come to my last slide, or my last 2 slides, I think, and that is the example. Now, what was basically the idea of the reform from 2014 to 2022? We had a lot of certain flaws in the reporting directive 2014. It was said the depth of reporting is not enough because you had to report not about the whole production chain, but only the first link of the production chain. And that first link, that first partner had to report on the rest. So that was somehow a compromise, not overburden the European companies, not doing the full reporting, so to speak. And sometimes one said, but those are not the most important items about which you report, which I do not think. Human rights and climate change, I think, are those items where you would say, there you can justify that companies should not only be return-oriented, but public good-oriented. I don't find this criticism very convincing. Of course, you can always say they should report on everything in the world, but then you overdo. Basically, you can destroy a good instrument also by making it too perfect, because then it overburdens really. So I would say that choice is pretty good. And sometimes it was said, but that reporting doesn't say the truth. Because you did not have the need that an accountant looks at it, and you did not have a liability rule. So you could greenwash your reporting and say, I'm very green, without really incurring any risk of liability. And of course, you had still the problem somehow of who is the addressee. Now, the 2022 directive tried to cure quite a bit of those criticisms I spoke about. There is now the accountant coming in. There is now potential liability. There is now a deeper reporting on the whole value chain. And therefore, my last question is really, is the non-financial reporting addressed to an addressee which will perhaps create that conscience of a better world, so to speak, a human rights and climate change accountable world? I have the my first answer is we have a new addressee in those reporting rules. As long as the reporting rules only were about the financial status of the company, those outside the company did not really care. A balance sheet of 100 pages or so is not interesting for an NGO, or is perhaps interesting for a big shareholder and a big creditor, but not for the rest. While the non-financial reporting is basically in prose, rather short in the annex, well condensed. That can be interesting also for those that are interested in climate, in human rights, for instance, for NGOs, for instance, as well for governments, for instance, for public opinion. So we have now two addressees, really. We have the shareholders as well, the Professor Grundmann who wants to invest and says a bit less of return, a bit more of green is okay. But you have those others as well. And that changes to some extent the information content. Because now we start to create about that issue, climate change, human rights, a public opinion, because others look at that. And you get more information, and that leads, for instance, to strategic litigation, that you say those big polluters, we sue them in court. The Shell case is a good example for that. Or the German Constitutional Court that said, well, basically, if we do not do anything now, the next generation will have to do everything. And that means if we do not have a certain inroad into the freedom to act now of our people now, we will have a very, very, very strong impact and inroad on that freedom to act in the next generation. And as we are responsible as German Constitutional Court for all mankind, for all German mankind, or at least as far as German law can reach, then we are responsible for the next generation as well. And it would be overly burdensome for the next generation to do something if we did not do it now. And therefore, the German Constitutional Court said there is a constitutional duty of the legislator to calculate how it has to be done to have somehow a scheme in order not to have too much burden in the future. All that basically was because the public opinion was developed more, and of course the data of the main polluter, basically to have basically of all the big companies, of the big indices, influenced that. That is the public opinion, which is much stronger equipped. Now the shareholders, that is interesting as well. And we come back to that concept of internalization. Because the shareholders, you think, well, the shareholders, that is a big group. They have all the same interest. They have all the interest of return. The basic economic model. But for quite a few decades, we already in company law research, we realize, of course, the shareholders are not a homogeneous class. They are very heterogeneous. There is the small investor, there is the institutional investor, there is the activist investor as well, there is the entrepreneurial investor. They all have different interests. The one wants to have an influence on the company, the other one just wants money from the company, and a third one, like the institutional investors, is perhaps particularly interesting. There was a CEO of CalPERS, which is the biggest investor in the world. It's the California Pension Fund. So all pensions basically are administrated by that institution, which invests into shares and securities. And CalPERS changed its opinion on the basis of public opinion to some extent, that the investment should be to some extent green. Once you had that, of course, that had a price influence. The stock of green companies rose. Now, everybody else saw CalPERS as the prime, well-informed investor, very professional. Oh, now we follow him. And how that following CalPERS reacts to the market is seen if you take just Germany ESG, so green investment. In 2014, 24 billion. In 2022, 580 billion. What does that mean? 23 times more. Of course, in 8 years, the economy of the world did not rise by 23 times. It rose perhaps, doubled perhaps, not even, but basically. So that means that this institutional investment that says we want to go into the direction of green means that certain shareholders have such a big influence because they think they internalize that value to some extent, and probably the CEO of CalPERS is rather similar to me. An old white man having 2 daughters and saying, why should I not invest the funds I can invest a bit more in the accountability of the public good? And basically, I would say, one can probably also say that green companies often are the strongest. Google is very green, Meta is very green, or they invest a lot into green, because to some extent, of course, it is a signal, of course, as well of strong companies that they can afford to be green because they have the finance for that. To that extent, I would say, yes, it is right what economists often say, that green and return are in a certain parallelism, but at the same time, I think the picture is much more complex, and we have to draw on all the sciences to understand the development and how the development might go. My outlook is rather positive. I think that it is a big challenge for mankind, but that is basically the right way to approach it. Many thanks for the attention.
Não podia o nosso evento, 200 anos da imigração alemã no Brasil, começar um evento hoje com a bela palestra e reflexão pelo professor Stefan Grudmer. Os nossos agradecimentos. Abro um parêntese para anunciar que está na nossa sala de conferência o ministro Marcos Belize, integra a segunda turma, primeira sessão do Superior Tribunal de Justiça. E também vejo ali o advogado Eduardo Ribeiro, ex-ministro do Tribunal Superior Eleitoral. Se a vista não alcançou a catarata, me perdoem. Então, agradecemos a palestra mais uma vez. Amanhã teremos a sequência do evento e eu devolvo a palavra ao cerimonial.
Nós agradecemos aos presentes pela participação nesta conferência de abertura e convidamos agora para o lançamento do livro Estudos em Homenagem a Canaris, que ocorrerá no hall do auditório externo do Conselho da Justiça Federal, acompanhado de um coquetel. A equipe do cerimonial irá orientá-los. Aos que nos acompanham remotamente pelo canal do YouTube Enfam Oficial, informamos que as atividades do seminário 200 anos da Imigração Alemã no Brasil retornarão amanhã às 9 horas. Devidamente autorizado, está encerrada esta solenidade de abertura. Desejamos a todos uma ótima noite.